Pontiac's War, the last stand against British rule, 1763 to 1766. The seeds of rebellion. The year was 1763, and the rolling hills, deep forests, and mighty rivers of the North American frontier stood at a crossroads. For over a century, the land had been a battleground between the great European empires. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, had finally ended, and the Treaty of Paris had granted the vast territories of New France to the British Crown. But for the indigenous nations who had fought and bled alongside the French, this was not a victory. It was a death sentence. The British, unlike the French, treated the Native American tribes not as allies but as subjects. Gone were the respectful trade agreements and gifts that the French had provided to maintain good relations. Instead, the British enforced harsh policies, cutting off trade supplies of gunpowder, food, and tools. At the same time, British colonists began pushing further into ancestral lands, constructing forts and settlements deep into native territory. One man, however, would rise against the empire. His name was Pontiac, an Ottawa war chief, and he had no intention of allowing his people to be conquered without a fight. A dream of resistance. Pontiac was no ordinary leader. He was a man of unwavering resolve, a master of war and diplomacy who understood that only through unity could the tribes hope to resist British expansion. Inspired by the teachings of Neelan, a Delaware prophet who preached the rejection of European ways and a return to traditional native values, Pontiac called for an alliance of tribes to drive the British from their lands. From the Great Lakes to the Ohio Valley, the call to war spread like wildfire. The Ottawa, Delaware, Shawnee, Seneca, Miami, Huron, and Potawatomi, warriors from all corners of the land, gathered to hear Pontiac's words. His message was clear. The British must be driven back, their forts reduced to ashes, and their soldiers cast out of the land forever. With the warriors united, Pontiac devised a bold and daring plan. They would strike the British at their strongest points, Fort Detroit, Fort Pitt, and Fort Niagara, launching a coordinated assault to cripple British control over the western frontier. The Siege of Fort Detroit. In May 1763, Pontiac's war began in earnest. Leading over 900 warriors, Pontiac laid siege to Fort Detroit, a powerful British stronghold. The battle was fierce. War cries echoed through the forests, and British soldiers fired their muskets in desperation as waves of warriors attacked the fort's wooden walls. Scalping knives flashed in the sunlight, arrows darkened the sky, and the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. For weeks, the British inside the fort struggled to hold out, but Pontiac's forces cut off supply lines, starving the defenders. The siege nearly succeeded, but a British reinforcement fleet arrived just in time, forcing Pontiac to retreat into the wilderness. Though Fort Detroit did not fall, it was clear that this was no small rebellion. It was an all-out war. A war across the frontier. While Pontiac led the assault on Detroit, his allies struck at other British forts. Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, and Fort Miami fell quickly, their garrisons slaughtered. Fort Pitt, a major British stronghold, faced relentless attacks, and its defenders resorted to biological warfare, infamously distributing smallpox-infected blankets to the besieging tribes in a desperate attempt to weaken them. As British forts burned, panic spread across the colonies. Settlers abandoned their farms, fleeing eastward in terror. Entire villages were massacred, and British forces found themselves overwhelmed. The British, unaccustomed to the Native American style of warfare, suffered defeat after defeat in the dense wilderness. The British counterattack. Realizing the war was spiraling out of control, the British Crown sent General Geoffrey Amherst to crush the rebellion. Amherst, known for his brutal tactics, ordered harsh retaliations against the native forces. British troops launched scorched earth campaigns, destroying villages and burning crops to starve out Pontiac's warriors. A turning point came in 1764 when Colonel Henry Bouquet led a force of British troops deep into the Ohio Valley. He won several key battles, forcing many tribes to negotiate peace terms. The British also offered treaties and promises, swaying some tribal leaders to abandon the war effort. Pontiac, seeing his allies dwindling and supplies running low, was forced to abandon his dream of driving out the British. In 1766, after years of fighting, he formally surrendered. The aftermath and Pontiac's fate. Though Pontiac's war failed to push the British out of native lands, it was not without impact. The rebellion forced the British government to rethink its policies, leading to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which limited colonial expansion westward. This, however, did little to protect native lands in the long run, as settlers ignored the decree and continued to expand into Indigenous territory. As for Pontiac, he remained a respected leader, but he had made powerful enemies among his own people. In 1769, he was assassinated by a Peoria warrior, likely under British influence. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy of resistance would live on, inspiring future Native leaders like Tecumseh and the great warriors of the American frontier. Conclusion: the war that shook the frontier. Pontiac's war was more than just a rebellion. It was a last desperate stand against British domination. It was a war fought not for power, wealth, or conquest, but for survival. The Indigenous nations who stood with Pontiac fought with unwavering determination, knowing that the loss of their land, culture, and way of life was at stake. Though the British ultimately held their ground, they learned an important lesson. Native resistance was far from over. The war exposed the vulnerabilities of British rule in North America, proving that the Indigenous peoples were not passive subjects, but fierce warriors willing to defend their homelands at all costs. This war set the stage for future conflicts, as Indigenous nations continued to fight against the relentless wave of colonial expansion. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued as a direct response to the war, sought to create a boundary between native lands and colonial settlements, but it was largely ignored by British settlers hungry for land. The British, though victorious in battle, failed to extinguish the spirit of resistance that Pontiac had ignited. The embers of defiance continued to burn, fueling future uprisings such as Tecumseh's War and the conflicts that shaped early American history. Pontiac's name would be remembered, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol of defiance, courage, and the struggle for freedom in a rapidly changing world. His leadership and vision proved that unity among Indigenous nations was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Though he was ultimately betrayed and assassinated, his legacy endured. His war was a turning point, a moment in history when the Native American nations made it clear that they would not surrender without a fight. The echoes of his resistance resonated for generations, inspiring leaders and warriors who continued to resist colonial rule. Pontiac's war was not just a historical conflict, it was a testament to the resilience and strength of the Indigenous peoples of North America. Their struggle did not end in 1766. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a part of our community. Here, you will find historical wars, inspiring stories, and unique content based on real events. If you want to see more engaging and fact-based stories, hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos instantly. Your support means the world to us. Leave a comment and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Raising hands fire. Bell, subscribe, share, and help us bring these incredible stories to the world.